Welcome to our session this morning, Rethinking Retirement Strategies for Longer Working Lives, which we are hosting with our strategic partner Aviva. While you're all settling in, as those of you who were in the keynote session this morning will know, I'm a bit of a fan of a polling question, and therefore, sticking with tradition, I have a polling question that I will be asking you once I've done a few introductions. So if you wouldn't mind getting your phones out, getting yourselves onto the Wi-Fi, you can see the details on the slide, and then getting yourself onto Slido. If you've only arrived at tea time, Slido is the app that we're using, Slido. You can just go onto slido.com on a browser. It's the quickest way to get there. Put in hashtag REBA Wellbeing, and you will be able to vote on polls. You'll be able to ask questions, which is going to be very, very important during the session. It's a panel discussion. I've got lots of questions up my sleeve, but I'm hoping that some of you have also got questions that you will be putting to the panel today. Now, I've mentioned the panel. I'm standing in front of them at the moment, but I've got right here behind me, I've got George Kingerby, EMA, Head of Pensions and Benefits at SMBC. In the middle, we have Emma Douglas, who's Managing Director, Workplace at Aviva. And on your right, my left, we have Christine Jackson, who is Director of Reward and Pensions at ITV. Now, firstly, I would like to say to you, our audience, small but perfectly formed, well done on picking this session. You are clearly the people with a firm eye on the future and the next big thing. The thing that I would say is going to bring a huge change to reward, to benefits. I've just been in a workshop discussing the interaction, the interplay we're going to see with insurances and pensions, and just generally well-being, all because of longer working lives. And I think up till now, especially as we've gone through a pandemic, we've had a big focus on well-being, on the health side. We've started to touch more into financial well-being, but it's been tempting to sideline retirement strategies because, you know what, once they've retired, they're not our problem anymore. Well, increasingly people working way past traditional retirement age. And as we know, or many of us in pensions know, we've got pensions freedom, so people can start accessing their pensions pots once they turn 55. This means that retirement strategies are affecting employers more, and they're going to affect your benefit packages, they're going to affect your pay decisions, and they're going to affect your well-being strategies. So therefore, I'm now going to ask to get my poll question in, because I'm interested. So if we can get the question up on, if you can have a look on your phones, if you can have a look at Slido, at the polling question, I want to know how many of you have or are reviewing, and I've termed it very broadly here, your financial well-being strategies and benefits for an aging workforce. So maybe you are reviewing, maybe you have reviewed and you're taking action. Maybe you have reviewed but you're not taking action yet. You are in the process reviewing. I've given you lots of options here. Plan to review, no plans to review, but you know that you should, but you haven't got plans yet, or you don't think you've got any reason to review. Well, I can see the results coming up here. Nobody believes there's no reason to be reviewing. That is the good news. And a third of you, so the biggest cohort, no plans to review, but we should. And then there's a third, planning to review, we are reviewing. So it's early doors, but this is a very interesting slide. I think this is a trend indicator of what we're going to see over the next year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years of the direction of travel when it comes to well-being. So enough of me talking. I've asked each of our three panelists to talk a bit more about themselves in a bit of an introduction from each of us, from each of them, looking at where their organisation's thinking is when it comes to retirement strategies for longer working lives. So as our two employer representatives on the panel, Christine and George will speak first. They'll focus on their own organisations, and then Emma will give the wider market view based on the work that she and the team at Aviva have been doing. So George and then, Christine first, and then George. Could you give us 3 minutes each on what are the key headline areas you are looking at within your own organisations with regards rethinking retirement strategies for longer working lives? Over to you, Christine.
Hello, everyone. So at ITV, one of the things we think a lot about is retirement in a DC plan. We have a trust-based DC plan. And one of the things that we think a lot about is how do we actually enable people to make decisions so they can use the flexibilities that are available to them and potentially interact those flexibilities with flexible working, so that in essence we don't see retirement as a cliff edge anymore. We see retirement as maybe a phased approach that can go through. That links back to other areas that we're thinking about, which is also skills and reskilling, and to what extent can you develop the skills for your workforce internally, so you're not having to pay extra to recruit people from the outside to come in and do that. So to what extent can you make that happen? And then I think it is also thinking about the intergenerational aspects of that if you've got a good mix of people, that helps in terms of diversity and lots of other reasons, lots of other positives like that. So how can we harness the benefits of a mixed intergenerational workforce to kind of get the best solution for ITV? So we have, ITV as an organisation, obviously we make and produce programmes and we broadcast them, and we've got ITVX. Hopefully you're all aware of ITVX as the streamer, and so we have a whole mix there of creatives, people making programmes, developing programmes, and also having a lot of technology functions focused on the digital aspects of delivering the what we need to broadcast or stream. And so essentially getting the right mix of population is key to our success and moving forward.
Thank you. So at SMBC, I think I joined the organisation about a year ago, and one of the first things I did was hold focus groups. And those were divided by age. And I think that the clearest message that came across from the over 50s was they just don't understand how they're going to take their benefits. So we're spending a lot of time thinking about how we're going to educate our workforce with two aims, really. One is to make sure that they understand realistically when they are going to retire, because a lot of the people who are in their late 40s or early 50s are probably the first generation who are wholly DC, and it's going to be very different to what they saw happen with their parents. So I think making sure they understand and they're realistic, so you don't have employees who are sat there thinking, I'm going to get to 60, it'll all be fine, and they really know where they are. I think the second thing is making sure they understand the options they're going to have and what they mean for them. So flexibilities, but also, starting to think about how they might use drawdown versus annuity over their retirement life, and what that means in terms of when they can afford to retire and what that's going to look like. So I think really it's kind of very, very education focused. And how do we get our current providers? We've got a contract-based DC. They've got wonderful apps and everything, but it's how do we make sure that they're actually giving a bit more face-to-face as well, because everyone's very happy to put a whizzy app in front of you, but there's a lot of employees who actually really want to be told face-to-face, what do I do? So it's how do we access that at a price point that's acceptable to the company as well? Thank you.
So, Emma, can you share your wider view of what you see employers looking at on this particular topic?
Yeah, thanks, Debbie. So we've got a Working Lives report that is going to be published on Monday. So you can go to the Aviva stand and sign up to get that report. But it's quite interesting in connection with what the answers were to that polling question. So actually we found that 1 in 10 employers were putting in place a strategy to think about the older employees in their workforce. So that's probably about aligned with what we saw in the room. And what support are employers doing? Well, it tends to be apprenticeship programs. I mean, we think of apprenticeships for young people, but this is apprenticeships for older people so they can learn some different skills, midlife MOTs, job sharing and opportunities for part retirement. So, some part-time work as you go into retirement. You were talking about that, Christine, as well. And again, looking at the report, around 44%, which is a massive number of the 56 to 64-year-olds that we talked to, were planning to move into this semi-retirement before they hit 65. So, it's not a cliff edge. They want to draw on some of their pension savings, but also continue in work for that period. So, some of that continuing in work is because they need the money to support that lifestyle, and some of it is for the social benefits, feeling part of a community and all of that kind of thing. So the broader well-being context as well. But, it's interesting to see this in the context of, what the government were trying to do in the spring budget, get more people back to work, investing significant money in the over 50s to get them back. So I do think Debbie's right that this is the start of a trend and the start of thinking about, how can we accommodate these longer working lives in the workforce?
So I want to stay with you, Emma, because I want to broaden this out and look at it through a broader HR lens. Pensions and HR, yes, they link together, but they've often been in silos. So we've talked about changing retirement patterns. We've talked about, I mentioned pensions freedoms. We've got unsupported decumulation. Now that's a piece of jargon for you, but this idea that George raised, that in the old days you had a DB scheme and it was done for you, and yet you now have to do it yourself. What does that mean for workforce planning? What do employers need to think about?
And I think, it will vary by industry, but I think, Debbie, overall, all of those things that you've talked about mean that more people are likely to want or have to work for longer. So, ultimately, we're going to end up with a workforce with more older people in it. And I think the other thing that comes into this is the state pension age increase, because a lot of people will be relying quite heavily on the state pension. So at the moment, you're not going to get that, it'll be 67, that state pension retirement age in 2028. Rises to 68 between 2040 and 2044, could rise to 69 by 2048, and there's some really horrible stats that it could be 74 by 2067. So not a worry for me, but thinking about the younger generations coming through, that's quite a biggie, because if you're not going to get your state pension, that's quite a big part of what you're relying on. How are you going to live in that intervening period? And I would also say that, for some industries, it's easier than others to think about how people can work for longer. And actually, one of the other things that comes out in the report is being able to work flexibly is quite a big deal for people. So, that actually makes people keener to get back into the workforce if they're thinking, I don't have to be in the office 24/7. That's actually a real benefit for a lot of people, and thinking, how do I get back into the workforce? And that's been actually really interesting as well. Some of the other stats we've seen is that more women are coming back into full-time work because they can work flexibly. And that's a massive stat, and that makes a big difference, because often it's women who have got, far less, about half of the pension pot of men by the time they get to retirement. But if we have more women working full time, that will actually help with the gender pension gap as well. So I think, a lot of different decisions to be made as people come to retirement with their DC pot, as George was saying. And I think we'll come on to that in some of the later questions as well, how we help people make those decisions, and how does an employer get involved in that, and should they?
So picking up on those points that Emma has made, Christine, I want to come to you, this idea that people might be working more flexibly, coming back into the workplace, working longer, lots of shifts coming down the line. What does that mean that reward, benefit, pensions, wellbeing people should be thinking about in terms of their pension strategies now to accommodate those changes?
So I think it is about seeing it as an opportunity. So you have highly skilled people or people who know and are successful within your organisation. How do you make it appealing for them to stay? And I think Emma's right, one of the big things is flexibility. And that can be both in terms of time, but also location. How much do you work from home versus how much are you coming into the office? And interestingly, I think there is a tension, Debbie, with the point that you made, which is one of the benefits of working is the social aspects and that point. So how do you get the right balance in terms of doing that? I think there is also the piece about thinking, and again, I keep coming back to skills, but I think there's almost an innate ageism, which is that if people get to a certain age and skills are no longer the thing that everybody's talking about. They're talking about, they're thinking about retirement. I think thinking about the skills, and to your point again, Emma, thinking about actually do we give older people the chance for sabbaticals, to do more study or to do other things that maybe they haven't done. So I think it's looking at the range of options that you've got and then bringing those together. I think also we need to recognise that throughout the population that we've got, we need to handle things like ill health and make it easy for people to recover and come back to work. So thinking about the insurances that you've got in terms of private medical or income protection and bringing those bits together, I think all of it needs to be thought through, and you need to have a considered strategy. And then, as I say, we spend a lot of time with our trustees thinking about the specifics about how people can access their pension and whether or not they're taking it as a series of lump sums or they do a partial transfer to buy an annuity to give them a fixed income so they've got their bills paid. Those sorts of things are the sorts of things that we're exploring.
I think just coming in on that. So I spent a little while on the dark side as an HR business partner. And one of the things that I did quite a bit, and this was in a financial services company, is we had employees who we wanted to keep who are in their maybe 50s, late 50s, who were burnt out, and they wanted to take time out, so 6 months a year. I think as a reward professional, one of the things you need to make sure is that those sabbatical leaves are properly covered so people don't feel like they're losing things. Because one of the first questions I always got asked as an HR business partner is, do I have my medical? Do I have my life assurance? Do I have my income protection? So trying to make sure that we're offering the flexibility with the right coverage so people feel willing to take it, I think is going to be critical.
So, George, staying with you, because you're sort of tapping into the next question I've got teed up for you. It's around that importance of employer communication around retirement options. This is probably a fairly new thing. People have done retirement planning for years and got somebody into the office and let them get on with it. But I've got a feeling that's starting to shift. So why is it that we're going to start to see good employers actually put more communication around retirement options in place for their older workforce?
So I think, first of all, it's just common sense. The most expensive benefit we offer to anyone is a pension. So you can destroy a lot of value in the pension by making poor decisions in the run-up to and at retirement. So why offer a very expensive benefit and not provide people with the support that ensures they get the value from it at the point they come to retire? So I think from an employer viewpoint, you're spending a lot of money. You need to make sure that people get the full value from that money, and providing the right support is a small incremental cost compared to the initial input you're making into the pension scheme itself. So there's a sound economic case. And I think secondly, we are, as we sort of alluded to, coming up to this point where we have people retiring in very different ways. So I think there is an expectation that the employer's provided the pension, the employer's going to help them navigate that process. Now, we all know there's a point at which they probably will need to take advice, but around 50% of your employees really want to be told what to do. So you have to take them as far down that journey as possible and really engage with them so that they are able to understand what they're kind of faced with, what their options are, and then the last little bit, they might need to take the step their own, but they feel in a far more comfortable place to do it. And I think as a good employer, you just have to find multiple routes to this, because different people are going to engage with different routes. And you can't think, I've done it, it's done, because obviously your workforce is constantly changing, but people are also constantly moving to that bucket. So you have to keep going back to the same messages time and time again and hitting the population as many different ways as possible.
Thank you very much. I'm going to come to you shortly, Christine, because I want to start talking about fraud, which has become a massive issue in recent years, especially with the pension freedoms and people making their own decisions. But before that, I just want to say I can see a lot of questions coming through on Slido, which is fabulous. I'm going to ask a couple more questions to the panel, and then we'll bring up Slido on the screens. I don't want to do it just yet, but I just wanted to flag up in case anybody's looking at the questions. If there's one question on there that you think, I didn't ask that, but that's a brilliant question, like it. It will help me know what to go through, because the way they're coming through at the moment, I'm going to have a lot of questions coming from the audience, which is fabulous. So Christine, I mentioned fraud. Why is that something employers really need to be thinking about now when it comes to pensions?
Well, I think essentially it's not a choice. I mean, we know there's been some terrible scandals in terms in relation to that, and because we've got a trust-based scheme, essentially the trustees are worried about aspects like transfer values, and there's a whole process they need to go through, kind of recognising the requirements from the FCA. But I think there is the kind of aspect. We were doing a lot of that stuff before we were required to do it, because there is in essence people just don't know the risks. It's talked about a lot more now, but pensions is one of those things that people feel like if I can delegate responsibility to some expert, then that will suit me down to the ground. And we've had some weird cases. We had somebody who took advice from somebody in the pub, and that all went terribly wrong. We've had people who were keen to transfer, and when we said, you do know you're transferring to Malta, they were completely shocked about that. So people are, even very intelligent, sophisticated people can do daft things around pensions. And so in essence, it's about just teaching them reasonable checks to be made and doing some of them on their behalf, so that they don't lose, to George's point, they don't lose something which is could be a vast amount of money and really impact their lives. So I think it's a fundamental now. With the amount of money that's in pensions, we need to just make sure that we don't kind of make it easy for people to exploit other people.
Thank you. Emma, I wanted to come to you, touching partly on that question already, but what are the rising implications of these poor accumulation decisions that employees could be making and will be making?
I mean, I'd really echo what George and Christine said. This is, it's such a crucial point, and I'm not sure that, we're sort of fully thinking about that decision-making point now. Looking again at our survey, 9 out of 10 employers said that they feel responsible for ensuring that their employees save for a comfortable retirement. So the saving bit is well understood, but I'm not sure this supporting people to make the decisions at retirement is quite as well understood, and it does need to be. There's some horrific risks. So, there's tax implications if you take it all as cash. There's fraud risk, as Christine was saying. And also there is a big risk that people are too cautious and they don't spend it. I think that's quite sad as well. Having spent all that time building up this pension pot, you're too worried to spend it because now it's drawdown and you haven't got a guaranteed income for life. So I do think it's incumbent on the industry to come up with some solutions. So Aviva have been thinking about this, and we're thinking along the lines of many others as well. So it's kind of the idea that perhaps you need a framework to help people think about how to spend the money. A lot of people, when they call our call centre, they start off with, I don't know where to start. And that, I kind of get that because there's so many choices out there. So, if it's not a default, and DC members do love a good default, if it's not a default, can we at least give a framework? So maybe it's something along the lines of, you can do drawdown in the early years, say for the first 15 years, 65 to 80, and you can be, because you've got a set period of time, you can work out so much more easily how much anyone can spend in any individual year. But by the time people get older and into later retirement, not only does potentially the spending needs change a little bit, but also at that point you really want some certainty that you're not going to run out of money. And that is where I think, some form of annuitisation, or it could be collective defined contribution in the future, it could be a deferred annuity, but some form of certainty of income is much more important in the later years of retirement, so you don't outlive your savings. And then alongside all of that, it's quite good to have a little bit of a cash buffer. So it's kind of, the rainy day pot, the occasional spending pot, so that people know it's there. And from a behavioural finance perspective, it makes them more willing to spend that money that they've got for drawdown. So I think there's ways we can help people with this, but it's definitely a problem. And I do think not having a big advice gap in the UK is an issue as well. The person who was taking advice down the pub, that probably wasn't a qualified financial advisor that they were talking to at that point. I won't say definitively, but it probably wasn't.
They definitely would. But I think, again, just reinforcing that, I think also we need to recognise that it's important to stay flexible ourselves. So for a long time when we were thinking about DC, we weren't expecting anybody to buy an annuity. Just the annuity rates were such that it was going to be too expensive. Now, obviously, things are slightly different. And one of the things we're talking about is potentially that people will buy an annuity at a level that will cover their bills. And then actually they don't have to worry so much about what they're doing with the other aspects of it. That may mean that they want to invest slightly differently. We also had people who got terribly excited about the idea that they could leave some of their DC pot to their family so that it could be used as an inheritance tool. And again, with all the pressures on younger people now and the ability to want to buy houses and all those sorts of things, there's so much opportunity within DC that we just need to recognise that making the options available to people is important. But to Emma's point, you also need to have a way of helping them make some decisions. And we don't really have anything that does that. And I've spent a long time looking for tools that we could use for our people so they could have a play and just get a sense of what was important to them. It just doesn't exist. So you're having to compensate for that by running sessions which are with people together, thinking about information that you can provide. But what we find is that once people get over the I don't want to talk about pensions, they'll come back again and again just to be reassured that actually they're thinking about the right things and has anything changed. So again, it can't be a once and done. It has to be a process and you have to effectively make pensions something that people are happy to talk about. And initially, people feel almost offended. I don't want to be thinking about that. I'm too young, or I would rather it was pushed back. Once people get over that and can see that they can take action steps and things that they can do, people engage very differently. So it's thinking about how do you make it come alive for people. And I think, as I say, employers can do that well.
So I want to bring up the questions that have been coming through fairly thick and fast at the moment. If we can get them up on screen, that would be really good. Because I want to pick up on that point about this engaging in pensions, and perhaps we can look at the wider financial well-being and the different ways of saving. And George, we haven't pre-discussed this one, but I'm hoping with your benefits hat on, now the questions move about quite a lot. So there's one question that's being asked in some different words several times. So I'm going to use this one. Have you seen trends for employers offering varied investment solutions? No, it wasn't that one. It was the one about, I wanted to know, beyond pensions. So this idea of not just making it the pension, but you've got the LISA, you've got the ISA, you've got other ways of getting people into the habit. I don't know if you're doing it where you are, whether you've seen a shift.
So if I'm honest, we're not doing it where I am. It is something, as I said, I've been there a year, so it's something I'm looking at is corporate ISAs and how and if we'd use those. I think when we spoke to employees about it, we did find a lot of employees who felt they could afford an ISA were already using an ISA. And we were saying, well, okay, I've got something, it's actually very competitive, you'd have to do a lot better. So I think, given it's quite individual, it's definitely something that is becoming something we want to look at a bit more. I think, ironically, it's maybe not for the older workforce, it may be more for the younger workforce who need to get them into the saving habit early, but being able to use the money for other things, and then getting to a point where you flip that into pension fully at a later date. So I think some of those things are actually more targeted around thinking about the more junior end of the workforce and getting them into the saving habit rather than the older end of the workforce. I mean, I think that the corporate ISA maybe has a place for the people who pre the lifetime allowance disappearing, wanted an alternative investment vehicle. The lifetime allowance may well come back, so we may well go back to that world again.
So we've never had a corporate ISA, and I've always been sceptical that we could do anything better than people could do individually. But what we have done, two things that we've done is to help people manage money is we've put a facility in to allow people to pay off loans, so effectively that it's deducted directly from their payroll. People really appreciate that because essentially it goes from their payroll before they get paid. They're not having to find the money at some other point, so we found that was useful. We tried sidecar savings, so the idea that you build up a savings pot and then it flips into pension. There was a limited take-up for that, but the people who did it were quite enthusiastic. But I think there is definitely, one of the bits that I've been rethinking is the idea that you help people save by allowing them to take money directly from their pay before it goes into their bank account, so that effectively they don't ever get to touch it. And so there is that we're doing more thinking about that. But I think it's recognising that sometimes the value you're adding is the ability for people to say, take the £20 and save it for me almost, rather than that they having to then take an extra step. So it's simplifying their ability to kind of do the savings habit, and so that's part of what we're kind of thinking about now is, do we actually have a way to make saving easier alongside pensions and other things?
Yeah, I mean, I think getting a little bit off the original topic, because this is the other end of the workforce, but at a previous employer, we put in place an arrangement where your core contributions went into the pension scheme, but if you opt to top up, your top up on our match will go directly to the student loan company to pay off your student loan. The reason we did that is we're told by a lot of our younger workforce, I'm not paying into the pension scheme, so I can't afford to because of my student loan. The take-up of that was actually incredibly low, despite the fact we went out and really advertised it. So it is interesting, there is a gap between what you're told about why people aren't doing things and why they actually aren't doing them.
Yeah, I do think that solutions in the workplace, we've offered a corporate ISA for a very long time and, relatively low take-up. I think the benefits that Christine was talking about of, it's gone before you've kind of had it in your bank account, that's really great. But I've actually had people say to me, but I don't want my employer to know about my private savings. And, you can explain, no, it's separate and only you see it, but people have got some kind of suspicion around that. So, and as you say, it has to be a good rate. It can't just be, kind of an average rate, because people will feel, well, I can go out and get something better than that myself. I do think some of the other benefits are quite useful. So things like mortgage advice, is actually really interesting now, and that's not necessarily just for the younger workforce. It's for parents trying to help their kids get on the property ladder as well. So I think there's some other financial benefits that maybe are not savings products that are actually quite valued at the moment.
And that's a really good point, because that's just flashed up on my phone that the interest rates in the UK have gone up to 5%. To just announce that now. So,
okay.
And if you don't own your own home at the point you retire, it's a big expense, and there has big implications on your future retirement. So retirement strategies do include home ownership, and I think we're going to hear that more and more. I want to move the conversation on a little bit. There's a great question that's come up here about encouraging employees to consider their target retirement age. So I'm going to come back to you first and foremost, because we were talking about this idea of people being able to set their goals and know what they're aiming for in retirement. What can employers do to help them envisage what the future might look like?
And I think for me, this is where tools like the PLSA's retirement living standards really come into play. So that's a basket of goods approach, and there's 3 levels. So there's minimum, moderate and comfortable. And it looks at what's it going to cost you to have that kind of lifestyle in retirement. Now, the cost of the minimum lifestyle for a single person has gone up a lot recently. So it's gone up to £12,800. And if you think the state pension maximum you get is 10,600, there's still private savings needed to get you to that minimum level. And that minimum level assumes that you're not paying a mortgage or rent in retirement, because people aren't now, but that will change as we roll through the generations. It assumes that you're not running your own car. And actually that's often a really big thing when talking to people about this. We actually had a little video that showed a bus going by, and that was amazing. It suddenly got people engaged with saying, oh, there's only 2 buses a week where I live. I can't live on that. And it got people thinking about what do you need to live on in retirement. But luckily, the minimum lifestyle does include Netflix subscription and a widescreen TV. So all is not lost.
But obviously, you can watch ITVX for free.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Christine. Yes. I'm sure that's included in there in the basket of goods.
So,
actually, just picking up on that, one of the things I think we need to really test ourselves on is the sense that people actually know with confidence what they're going to be doing in X number of years' time. And I think we put a lot of pressure on people to try and imagine what their lives will be. I think if you look back 5 years and thought about what your life was then to now, I'm not sure you would be living the life you would have expected to do. But I think that's part of it, is encouraging people to think there are steps that you can take now which will give you more options going forward, and then you can evolve from there. A lot of what we do now is still trying to get a one moment in time decision. That's when you retire, that's when you need to do it. I think we just need to be a bit more sophisticated and not make people feel uncomfortable by the idea that they cannot picture what their retirement will be. But say that doesn't mean that you shouldn't be taking steps to save, to give you options, to give you flexibilities. And if you do better, that's great. Now, obviously, we need to recognise that we don't want people investing in very risky assets very close to retirement, but I think there are ways of doing that. So we just need to be balanced in terms of how we engage with people, that we don't try and make them define what they're looking at. I mean, often people talk about it being like a holiday. A holiday is much more short term, and you've done one of those before. Retirement, you haven't. So we just have to think about how we engage people, I think.
I think just on the question about the target retirement age, as an industry, that we are getting better. So I'm not going to talk about my particular provider, because I think actually a lot of the contract and master trust providers are getting there, where they provide something on their app which allow people to go in and use terms which they'll understand around, I want X, Y, and Z based on the PLSA standards. And then that will allow them to play, okay, if I save a bit more or retire a bit later, how does that affect my ability to achieve those things? So I think as the providers get better about providing tools that do it in plain English and in language people can use and understand, it's then as an employer, how do we get people to actually go and engage with those apps? Because it's still far easier to get someone to engage with a banking app than a pensions app. So, but some of the tools are there for people to start thinking about it in a slightly less feels like a less technical way for them and engage. As an employer, it's how do you get them there so they're actually using it.
I want to flip the questions around, because we're focusing a lot on employees and getting them to think about their future and what that could look like. I want to now think about this through with a benefits hat on, through a lens of a reward and benefit director, a wellbeing director. You've got an increasingly ageing workforce coming down the line. You've got a certain budget that's been put aside for everything from pay, benefits and insurances. I'm going to start with you, Christine, but perhaps George will have a view of this. When you're looking at this and you've got older workers, the average age of people going off long-term sick is 52, which is very young, obviously, because I'm a bit older than that. But that has an implication for your claims from your income protection, lots of things that you're going to be trying to balance in the workforce. How do you look at your benefits budget overall and work out, what do I do? Where do I put the money? Can I afford to be putting in all this extra support for my older workers at the cost of my younger workers? Do I take it from my insurance? How are you thinking about that at the moment?
So I think essentially we just need to be careful that we don't see older workers as an amorphous mass. You have younger people, and some of the scary stats, I think, in terms of younger people and cancer really we just need to challenge ourselves on that. I always think when we're thinking about things like insured benefits, what's the other cost? So effectively, if people aren't looked after and unable to come back to work, you're recruiting a nightmare at the moment, getting the right people and the right skills. So I think you have to balance it as a genuine return on investment piece, which is if we're investing in our people and supporting them, then to what extent does it mean that we're not spending money on benefits, that are really, wasted's the wrong way, but you think about your recruitment costs, they're absolutely massive. You think about the time lost, they're huge. So I think you do need to think about things like private medical, income protection, and the insurers now are great at actually helping people manage their illness to get back to work. And so I think working in harmony with those things is the way to do it. But for me, it's a return on investment, and it's recognising that all the workers aren't necessarily your most expensive workers. They can bring value in different ways. And so I think you have to think across the generations and think about the benefits that are useful at moments in time. People talk about the moments that matter. That's what we need to be doing, is making sure we have the benefits that are ready for those kind of key moments.
I think as I went around a couple of the sessions this morning, one of the things that I took away on this point was getting back to think about health and well-being together. But actually, one of the biggest returns on investment you can on the health side is really focusing on lifestyle, because while not every illness is lifestyle caused, many morbidities are. And actually, the more you can help employees with their lifestyle and understand their lifestyle decisions, the more you can do to prevent some of the things that are going to cause heavy use of your health provider.
Well, I'm always a bit wary about that, though. It feels like you might be overstepping a bit, so it's you've got to get a balance, I think.
Right, I can see we've got 4 minutes left, and I wanted to come back. I'm going to come to you, Emma, on this particular one, because there's one very popular question sitting there right at the top of our screen that I've been ignoring up till now. But it sort of ties a little bit this idea of where is the line for the employer in getting involved with people's retirement planning decisions. The question, word for word, is with more people utilising drawdown, how do you encourage people to review their investment strategy to see if the default lifestyle path is right for them? Now, that's probably a whole panel discussion in itself, but just broadly, I'm sure there's lots of people in this room going, do I have to bring in a whole bunch of financial advisors? How far do I go? This sounds like an interesting area. How do you even begin to start to realise that you're opening cans of worms with these decisions now?
And I think that you start off by looking at what's the default strategy for the scheme, and obviously that's broad brush. So far more schemes now are creating a drawdown default strategy. So that's what most people will go into. And so that does mean that you don't de-risk as much, you retain more risky assets so that you're not radically de-risking, then re-risking as you go into drawdown. So at a scheme level, it's probably look at the demographic, looks what makes most sense for your workforce. And generally, we're seeing far more schemes set a drawdown strategy that takes you through, really to and through retirement as a strategy and maintains risk throughout. Now, within that, of course, there will be individuals who don't want to do that, and it's not suitable for them. So then we are back to the big challenges of pension communications, of trying to get people to understand this is what's going to happen unless you do something. So getting a default right is vital, because most people, let's be honest, will stay with that default, but then really trying to target some of those communications around people, who that is not going to be suitable for. And you don't always know, because if someone's got, say, a very small amount of money built up in your employer scheme, they might have lots of money elsewhere. So, it's a really, really tricky one. I've seen sort of split default strategies being put in place whereby people with, higher levels of income or higher pension pots were into a drawdown strategy, lower levels of income and lower pots into cash. I'm not sure it's that easy. I really think that's potentially oversimplifying and also has a danger. So, not an easy answer there.
So it's not an easy answer, but again, I think one of the things that we've done is we created an investment profiler where we ask a series of 8 or 10 questions for people, and basically, based on their answers, we say, based on your answers, you look like this type of person. Typically, somebody like you will invest in Blur, and part of that isn't really to give people an answer; it's to give them the confidence to work through the questions that only they know the answers to, and enable them to answer those questions and think about where they sit in the options that are available. So I've always been wary of defaults and wanted to encourage people to take decisions for themselves. So there are things that you can do, and that wasn't particularly expensive. It's something that we've kind of got on our website, but it needed thought and effort on our side, and it's massively complicated in the background, but it's easy for individuals, and actually it just gives people the confidence to do that, and they can do it 2 or 3 times and come up with different answers depending on what they want to do. But it shows them the effect of if I want to take risk, if I don't want to take risk, and kind of walks them through that. But we try to do it in a fun way as opposed to a boring way.
And I think, as both the other panelists said, it's about education and about engagement so that people are thinking about it. But once they've done that bit, actually, a lot of the providers now are providing funds that are very clearly labelled. This is an annuity targeting fund. So if you can get them to the education point, actually then the fund selection, if they're not going to do drawdown, is straightforward because things are clearly labelled. So the education, as everyone said, that's the challenge, and whatever works for your workforce to get them to the point where they're thinking, well, that's probably the answer to me for this proportion of my fund.
Great, perfect. Thank you very much. That was a great way to end that particular panel. We could have answered a lot more questions, but thank you for taking the ones that we were able to get to. We give our panel a big round of applause.